The cold bit at their faces as they reached the lip of the gorge, where the forest abruptly gave way to the jagged mouth of the earth, a gaping wound carved over eons into the limestone by rain, wind, and time, and from that abyssal crack oozed a scent of moisture, mildew, and something subtler, sour, like rotting meat left too long beneath wet leaves, unnoticed until it curdled into something that lived again only in the nose. And Danny, the youngest of the group, hesitated at the edge, peering down into the dark that swallowed his headlamp's beam within 30 feet, as if light itself was afraid to go any deeper. They were 5, Amanda, the experienced spelunker whose obsession with the unexplored crevices of this specific cave system had driven them here, Greg, her on-again off-again boyfriend with a lean face and hands that shook slightly when the cold hit his joints. Sean, built like a tank with a Marine's disposition and a bad temper to match, Clara, quiet and wide-eyed, Amanda's friend since high school, who had come only to support but had said little since they left the van, and Danny, a geology student with more eagerness than sense, who carried their gear and fumbled every clip, knot, and rope as if performing for an invisible audience. Amanda had shown them maps. Outdated ones, hand-drawn in the 1970s by an old cave biologist named Rainey who went missing trying to chart the lower branches of the system known locally as the Maw, named less for its shape than for its reputation. Every few years, someone wandered into its deeper channels and didn't come out, and those search teams went in after them. They found nothing but dropped helmets, scrawled names on limestone walls, and in one case, a femur too clean to have come from any animal that made sense. They descended slowly, lowering themselves with thick nylon ropes into the initial chamber, a bowl-shaped cavity 20 meters across with slick walls like black glass, and even with 5 headlamps blazing, the darkness beyond the immediate circle of visibility pressed in tight, as if it had weight, as if it breathed. Amanda led them into a narrow corridor on the far wall, one she had found last spring but hadn't dared enter without backup, and as they slid sideways through the stone pinch, brushing up against rock cold enough to draw the heat from fingertips, a sound reached them, not a human sound, not even animal, but a distant clatter like pebbles dropping in rapid succession, followed by what could have been breath or the echo of their own movement, except no one had moved. The tunnel opened into a cathedral-like space, vaulting 20 meters high, the floor uneven and strewn with jagged spires of stone that rose like ribs from the belly of a buried beast, and in the middle was a pit, perfectly circular, 3 meters across, ringed with a lip so smooth it looked sculpted, and from it rose a heat so sudden and wet it fogged their headlamps. Greg knelt to look in and recoiled. Something's moving down there. They gathered around, peering in. At first they saw nothing, then, as the fog receded, something shimmered, wet, pinkish, and pulsing. It slithered away, too fast to track. Clara gagged and turned from the hole. Amanda, against the warnings of the others, clipped in and lowered herself down. Her rope went slack halfway in. Then it jerked, once, violently, and something snapped. Her scream was short, guttural, and final. When they hauled up the line, it came up limp and wet. The harness was gone. What returned was a rope with a frayed, bloody end. Sean wanted to go in after her, but Greg stopped him, gripping his shoulder so hard his knuckles turned white, and for a moment they just stared at each other in silence, the reality of what had happened clinging to the humid cave air like spores, like mold on bread, creeping, spreading, unwelcome but undeniable. "I didn't hear her hit the bottom," Clara whispered, voice cracking, eyes wild. Danny sat against the wall, breathing fast, eyes locked on the blood-wet rope coiled at his feet like a snake that had just eaten. "Then there isn't one," Sean said finally, jaw tight, "or whatever's down there isn't bottom." They argued. Clara wanted to leave, to get help. Greg insisted that climbing out now, through the narrow shaft and back up the gorge wall in the dark, was too dangerous. Sean paced. Danny sobbed quietly into his gloves, whispering Amanda's name like a charm that might bring her back. After an hour of indecision, Sean cracked. "If she's alive, every second we waste matters," he growled, and before anyone could stop him, he grabbed a second rope, clipped in, and dropped into the pit. He didn't scream. Not at first. But within seconds of disappearing into the dark, a sound echoed up from below that made every hair on their bodies rise. Wet crunching, like raw meat torn from bone, followed by a gurgle, and finally a voice not like Sean's but shaped like it, high and broken and bubbling, crying, "It's chewing me. Oh God, it's chewing me," then silence. Something spat his helmet back up. It hit the lip of the pit with a wet smack, cracked, and rolled toward Danny. Inside were teeth, Sean's, 4 of them, jammed into the padding like someone had crushed his jaw against the inside before discarding it. Clara ran. She got maybe 20 feet before something grabbed her from the dark beyond the circle of their lights. A hand? No, not a hand, but something shaped like one, gray, too many fingers, long as thigh bones and thin as pencils, with skin that stretched like wet parchment between its joints, and it pulled her sideways into a hole no bigger than a man's shoulders. She screamed, shrieked, scratched at the walls with her nails, leaving wet, red trails as her skin shredded, and then she was gone. Greg and Danny stood there, paralyzed, their lights trembling in their hands. The blood on the floor was already soaking into the stone. Greg took Danny by the arm and dragged him back into the previous chamber, away from the pit, away from the thing that waited in the dark beyond the reach of light and reason, and as they scrambled over slick rocks and dodged stalagmites like rotted teeth jutting from the ground, they felt the pulse again. That low, rhythmic thrum, like the earth had a heartbeat. Danny said it first, "The cave is alive." Greg wanted to laugh, to tell him he was hysterical, that caves didn't live or breathe or feed, but the words died in his throat when they reached a corridor they hadn't taken before, one Greg swore hadn't been there when they first entered. The walls here looked different, smoother and redder. He touched one. It was warm. And it moved. The stone beneath his fingers shifted slightly, like muscle reacting to pressure, and he recoiled as the surface beneath his touch convulsed and split, revealing a thin, vertical slit lined with twitching, pinkish tendrils. They ran. Every corridor now branched impossibly, the walls gleaming with moisture that smelled unmistakably of blood, the rock veined with dark striations that pulsed faintly with the rhythm of a heartbeat, and above them, somewhere in the stone itself, they heard chewing. Long, slow, wet. They stumbled into a chamber lined with what looked like bones, human, animal, both, and Danny tripped on a rib cage whose owner had been peeled open like fruit, their organs scooped out and dried into brittle strips pinned to the wall with rock-hard stalactites like macabre butterflies. There were faces in the stone, mouths open mid-scream, eyes gouged or melted or fossilized, their agony pressed into the rock like it had digested them and chosen to remember. Then the tunnel behind them closed. Not like a cave-in, no rumble or crash. Just gone. Where the entrance had been was now solid wall, pulsing, pinkish red, and faintly sticky. Danny started scratching at it with a climbing pick. The wall bled. It oozed thick, black-red sludge and let out a low moan, like something waking from a deep, angry sleep. By the time they found what might once have been Amanda, she was no longer alone. Her body was sprawled across a stone dais, her ribcage split open like a flower blooming in reverse, sternum cracked and pulled apart by metal hooks that looked forged but were actually grown from the walls themselves, organic and rusted and barbed, and nestled in her chest cavity, replacing her lungs and heart, was a cluster of eggs, translucent and wet, each one pulsing with something moving inside. She blinked. Her eyes were white. No pupils, no irises, just milk-colored orbs that tracked their movement like insect eyes, motion only, no recognition, no humanity, and her mouth opened slowly, unnaturally wide, as if her jaw was no longer constrained by bone. She spoke. Not English. Not anything with words. Just a noise, a shrill, metallic keening that rose in pitch until their teeth ached and their noses bled. The eggs pulsed. One of them hatched. The thing that slid from it had too many legs and no head, just a circular mouth ringed with barbed teeth that spun, and it latched onto the ceiling and crawled sideways across the rock with impossible speed. Danny collapsed, blood pouring from his ears. Greg picked him up and ran. He didn't know where. Just away, into corridors that smelled like bile and death, past skeletons that still twitched when touched by light, through tunnels where the walls wept pus and bone grew like ivy, until finally, impossibly, the air grew cooler. And then, light. Faint. Natural. A hole above, barely big enough to fit through. Greg shoved Danny upward. Something screamed behind them. He climbed. The wall pulsed. Fingers reached. But he clawed his way into the air and out, into morning. But Danny was gone. Greg never spoke again, not after the rescue team found him curled in the brush outside the gorge, covered in blood that wasn't his, muttering to himself and clutching a rock shaped like a skull fragment. They found no bodies. No cave system. Just a rocky overhang and dead trees. The gorge was filled in, like it had never existed. No pit, no tunnel, no maw. But Greg's fingernails were broken down to meat and blood, and his arms bore deep slashes from where something had held him, and his back was marked with bruises in the shape of 2 long fingers. In the hospital, he clawed at the walls at night, whispering about the heartbeat beneath the floor. About the veins in the earth. And about how Amanda was still alive down there, birthing things that would one day crawl to the surface and find us. And when the nurses found him dead, 2 weeks later, his chest cavity was open. His ribs cracked outward. And inside, eggs. Pulsing. Waiting.